us, and we're willing to be flexible so that we can continue to offer this great program. We can't thank you enough. Finally, we acknowledge that this is new territory for us, and we ask for your patience as we navigate through offering through them together. The first bump is that I forgot to start the recording for this webinar, so thank you very much to my colleague who started it. Got through that bump, we'll get through any more. 5 hours is a long time for an online event, so participants should feel free to take breaks as needed over the course of the event. We've built in some short breaks along the way to reset between presenters, so feel free to use that time as you see fit. We will record all of today's sessions except for the panel presentation, and we will make recordings available on our website following the event. And closed captioning of this event is available by clicking on the CC button in Zoom. So at this point, I'll invite Verletta Kern, the University of Washington Library's Digital Scholarship Librarian, to say a few words about why we're here today.
Good morning. We hope you're all here because you see equity in the production of and access to research as a social justice issue. Currently, we're caught between a deluge of information and a thinning gap of credible news sources, as is evidenced by the news deserts popping up throughout the United States. Yet much of our research continues to be locked behind paywalls, available only to a privileged few with the right kind of institutional affiliation to access. It shouldn't take a worldwide pandemic for researchers and publishers to come together to share research openly so that new discoveries can be made and problems can be solved together. Yet even when we make good faith efforts to provide open access to materials, we still favor those with deep subject knowledge, access to technology, and the privilege of seeing themselves represented accurately in research. As researchers, we need to consider our role of communicating our research broadly to a variety of audiences as part of our scholarly process. This doesn't just stop after an article is written and published, but is an ongoing commitment to continuing to educate and advocate for our research. Likewise, in our dual roles as educators, educating our future global citizens, many of us are scrambling to shift to online-only instruction right now. And as we do so, we need to think critically about the associated impacts of access to digital tools and resources to support online-only education. We also acknowledge that equity in the production of scholarship, we acknowledge that research design at times has produced harm, and we strive to do better. We also acknowledge that there have been times where sharing research openly can produce harmful consequences to already marginalized groups, and we need to think critically about this. We acknowledge the labor that goes into the production and sharing of research. And finally, we recognize that by their own positionality, some people are in a better place to more openly share their research than others. Some of you may wonder, what does all of this have to do with libraries? Libraries care deeply about the entire life cycle of research, from the conception of an idea to the creation and dissemination of new knowledge. We are your partners on that journey, looking to support you along the way. At the UW Libraries, part of our new strategic plan encourages us to advance research for the public good. Libraries see access to information as a right that should be available to all, not just a privilege for the few who enter our institutions or to those who can pay for it. Going public, opening scholarship to all, is an exploration of this idea of sharing our research not just with each other in the academy, but with anyone who has curiosity and a desire to learn. It's also about thinking critically about voices who have been underrepresented in the research process and planning for inclusive design. We look forward to exploring these ideas and themes with you throughout the day today. And at this time, I'm very pleased to welcome Nikkita Oliver as our keynote speaker this morning. And before introducing her, I'm going to take a quick pause for Nikkita to test her mic, make sure that this works.
Good morning.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nikkita.
Yeah.
While I'm introducing Nikkita, I'll invite her to share her screen and her slides. And during her talk, Nikkita will periodically ask you to respond to questions via the webinar chat. If you have questions for Nikkita during her talk, you can submit them through the Q&A feature of Zoom, and our Q&A moderators, Elliot Stevens and Joanne Chern, will share them during the question and answer period. You can also share any comments you have with Nikkita about her talk using the chat feature. Nikkita Oliver is a Seattle-based creative community organizer, abolitionist, educator, and attorney. Working at the intersections of arts, law, education, and community organizing, she strives to create experiences which draw us closer to our humanity and invites us to imagine what we hope to see in the future. She has opened for Cornell West and Chuck D of Public Enemy, has been featured on The Breakfast Club, KOUW's Week in Review, Cut Stories, and performed on The Late Night Show with Stephen Colbert. Her writing has been published in the South Seattle Emerald, Crosscut, The Establishment, Last Real Indians, the Seattle Weekly, and The Stranger, and she organizes with No New Youth Jail and the Seattle People's Party. Nikkita is the co-executive director of Creative Justice, an arts-based alternative to incarceration and a healing engaged youth-led community-based program. Nikkita was the first political candidate of the Seattle People's Party running for mayor of Seattle in 2017, narrowly missing the general election by approximately 1,100 votes, coming in third of 21 candidates. Nikkita speaks and performs for events at universities and conferences and facilitates trainings on equity, law and justice, education, and arts activism all over the United States. Please join me in virtually welcoming Nikkita Oliver.
Well, good morning, y'all. This is quite an interesting way to give a keynote. I'm so glad that you decided to spend your morning with me. And I just want to first start by acknowledging we are in some very strange and challenging times. And if we were in person, I would ground us for a moment. So I'm actually going to invite us to do that now. So I can't see you, so I have no idea if you participate in this, but wherever you are, whatever you're doing, maybe you're still in your bed, maybe you're still in your sweats, maybe you're in your living room, but wherever you are, if you could feel your body against your chair or your feet on the floor. And I'm going to invite you or encourage you to close your eyes. And as you do that, I would like for you to take in a deep breath, a grounding breath, and find some place that causes you to feel centered or rooted, whether that's an image or a person or an idea. Allow that to permeate where you're at as you feel your breath exit your body. And then I would like for you to take a second breath and allow it to pass deeper past the first breath. And if you're anything like me, you have spent majority of your week on Zoom calls, maybe multiple calls at a time, maybe back-to-back calls. Maybe you stressed about food or shelter or someone in your life who needs food or shelter, or maybe the current illness that's happening around us is also affecting you in other ways. And as you release that second breath, I invite you to release those feelings. Allow yourself to maybe feel free for a moment. And then I invite you to take a third breath. And I would like for this breath to be a moment of acknowledgement, to acknowledge the place that you are, to acknowledge the land that you're on, to acknowledge the space that you're in, to acknowledge the body that you're in. And as you release that third breath, commit yourself to being present in this moment, no matter how odd it may be to deliver a keynote via Zoom, and invite yourself to be present and open for the discussion. And I'll give you a few seconds to release that breath. So I'm really honored to be here today thinking about what going public means. And I really want to do that from the perspective of thinking about public libraries and public institutions. Some of the things that I want to think through is how libraries are or were developed. What is the history of libraries? What is the purpose that libraries have filled? And what is the purpose that libraries can continue to fill, especially as we move into a evolving digital age, and also in this current time frame that we're in, where we're expected to social distance, where many institutions are closed. How do libraries remain relevant in a post-COVID-19 world? And then thinking about libraries as a place for democratizing, for politicizing, for creating equity and access to resources. So part of my goal for today is for us to experience this as a conversation. So I encourage you, grab a notebook, grab a pen, write down thoughts, write down inspirations, write down ideas, things that you want to look deeper into, because I hope that this conversation inspires some ideas. I also want us to reconsider what we mean when we say something like knowledge is power. The idea that simply having access to information is both a position of power and a powerful act, but also the ability to decide what we view as knowledge or what we view as valuable or important knowledge. I think of this in the world of stories. For me, one of the very expansive moments in getting my master's of education was being in a class called The Theory of Knowledge, where we literally talked about how we form knowledge, how we decide what knowledge we pass down, but also how we decided whose knowledge is important. One of the educators I had the opportunity to learn from, she, as a Native woman from Turtle Island, talked about how she first teaches her children indigenous stories about environment and about planet before she engages them around Western science, because of the value that story has in terms of helping us learn, but also the cultural value and the roots that are in it. And so whose culture, whose stories, whose knowledge gets to be a part of what we consider to be power? And how do we expand that? How is that an evolving, growing thing? Which brings me to the idea of thinking about, oh, what does it mean to be a gatekeeper? And when we think about libraries or we think about institutions like universities, that is a gatekeeping power. We not only get to decide what information flows out, but we get to decide what information flows in and who gains access to it. And so how do we also have that be an expanding idea or definition in a capitalist world where we've commodified knowledge, commodified access to knowledge? And how do we treat access to knowledge as a right and not as a privilege or something you access if you have the money or the capital to access it? Libraries have not always been public. In fact, public libraries have really only existed for the last 120 years. And who's had access to libraries has been decided by race, class, gender, ability. Did you have the opportunity to learn to read? Which also makes me think about, how are libraries a place of oral storytelling, a place of knowledge sharing in person? What makes libraries a place for building relationship? And so I also have a goal of us at the end of this generating some ideas more than finding answers. I want us to think about libraries having a diversity of tactics for creating access, a diversity of tactics for embracing community, and a diversity of tactics for evolving and continuing to evolve this idea of public access, open access, as opposed to, what capitalism builds us into, an idea of privileged access, commodified access. And then what do libraries look like in this technology age? How do libraries and internet and technology actually work together, as opposed to this idea that they work in opposition, or they make brick and mortar libraries obsolete, which I don't believe at all. So I want to think about first the history of libraries. Libraries have been around for a very, very long time, though not always public. The first ancient library was in Mesopotamia. And you had different types of libraries. You had temples, you had palace libraries, and you had private libraries. And the first great library that we know of historically, and I'm sure there were others probably, is the Library of Alexandria, which housed nearly 500,000 scrolls. And, you know, mass printing did not exist. So people would travel from great distances. Scholars would travel from great distances to arrive at the Library of Alexandria to study. And this first library was not necessarily a public library. You had to be a scholar or have some sort of right or privilege to access. And so as a result, libraries, while they were in this example, started to become a place to preserve culture, to preserve state knowledge, to preserve religious knowledge. It was not something that was open access for everyone. And yet that doesn't mean that people were not preserving knowledge or preserving stories. Oral storytelling has, for many cultures, always been a very important part of passing down knowledge. And in fact, keeping knowledge an open, public, accessible thing, because oral storytelling often happens in public. Libraries are a testament to the culture of a society. So when I think about the history of libraries and the role that libraries have played, I also have to think about them in connection to things like war, imperialism, and colonialism. Conquerors often would go into communities, into places, and destroy libraries or destroy the knowledge keepers, or who we might call now librarians, as a way of taking over a place, because libraries or knowledge keepers preserve information, they preserve stories, and they become a way of passing that information down and having a cultural exchange. So the ways in which libraries are treated also within the world of conquest have played a role in how a place has been able to, how a culture or a group of people have been able to survive and preserve their cultural and identity, even in the midst of things like imperialism or colonialism. You see or hear stories of many people, many groups throughout the history of the world doing everything they can to preserve their scrolls, to preserve their cultural artifacts, because of the value that holds. And so we can't talk about libraries really without also thinking about museums and the impact that museums have on our opportunity to learn about and from each other, but also just the struggle that museums present, especially in a world where a lot of colonial governments have taken the artifacts or stories of other places, put them in museums where the people whose artifacts and stories those are not even able to access them, but other people are, which brings us to ethical considerations. Back to that idea of gatekeeping. Is gatekeeping appropriate? What do we do with these stories and artifacts? And thinking about what does it actually look like evolving and moving forward with this idea of going public? Is there a reparations or restoration component to going public that we need to grapple with, both within the library system and the museum system, but also within the university or educational institution system? So moving forward from these ancient libraries, libraries on Turtle Island, and when I talk about Turtle Island, I'm talking about what we in the colonial mindset now call the United States. Libraries started on Turtle Island in the Library Company of Philadelphia. It was originally a library for only subscribed members, which had issues around privilege and access. But what was unique about this was people came together and worked together to purchase books. Now, books at this time were not widely printed, and there maybe would only be a few copies of books in any given place, or really on any given landmass. And so together, these members worked to purchase books and became one of the first successful lending libraries. Now, it was not a public library because you had to be a subscriber in order to borrow those books. And so there were obvious barriers to access based on class. There were also barriers to access based on gender and race, who was allowed to read, who was allowed to have access to knowledge at the time. But it was a fundamental shift in this idea of people at least coming together to create spaces on Turtle Island where knowledge and story could be coalesced in one space. In 1845 and 1850, the United Kingdom, Parliament did the Museum Act of 1845 and the Public Libraries Act of 1850, which you began to see an explosion of new libraries, not just in Europe, but also on Turtle Island. So Boston and New York around the end of the 19th century started to create public libraries that were not subscription based and also were not tax funded. They were funded by philanthropists. Between 1883 and 1929, Carnegie helped grow libraries. And what was very dynamic about having libraries as a physical space is they often would change the cityscape of a place that they were built, because the city would start to be built around the library. It would become a place where people could congregate. It became a place where people could access knowledge, even if they didn't have access to a university or access to traditional schooling. And so cities would literally build up around a library as a point of congregating and a point of access. Libraries in the 19th century also became a site of contentious debate and public struggle. So lending libraries both as a social space, but then as a democratizing space for access, for storage of knowledge, and for circulation was very important for seeing democracy on Turtle Island grow and expand beyond just the privileged elite who had access to knowledge about democracy or knowledge about how a nation state works. I think about this within the context of doing a lot of work in the prison system and have worked with jailhouse lawyers, the value that even just having even a law library that maybe doesn't have the most up-to-date things for an incarcerated individual becomes a huge sense of power, of empowerment, and an ability to advocate for oneself. So similarly, in the 19th century, libraries started to decrease issues of inequity. Limitations of class started to not exist within the public library system because they were free and open to the public. Issues of gender and race were starting to no longer be a problem, as well as more people had access to public education, more people could read and would have the opportunity to use the library as a place to build their own knowledge base. And what is dynamic about books and libraries is that as the place builds a social life based on who comes there, books acquire a social life through the exchange and use of those books. So you have the conversations that happen between people within the library space. You have the conversations that happen between people who access the library and librarians, but then you start to have the conversation that happens between people who borrow the same book, even if they're not having a direct conversation with each other. The exchange of a book, the use of a book by multiple people, in and of itself creates a social life and public discourse about an idea, a story, or a piece of information. And so this is part of what makes libraries dynamic, not just as a space or place, but also as a concept or an idea, and also creates the opportunity for libraries to be a place that starts to create more equity and create access of knowledge. So there's some elements, some additional elements of libraries that I really want to sift through. And one of it is the lending and trusting relationship. And we are seeing libraries across Turtle Island start to get rid of fees or get rid of late fees, both because it's economically inequitable. Sometimes people don't bring books back on time for a reason, but also penalizing people when they don't, especially if you do not have the resources to be able to pay for that fee, is a sort of economic disenfranchisement. I have young people that I work with, some of whom at one point probably had 3 or 4 library cards under different names, just as a way of being able to keep access to the library when sometimes they would delay on returning a book. So getting rid of some of the constraints that make lending books challenging or accessing that lending is one way in which libraries are continuing to evolve the notion of who they are. But libraries also create a trust relationship. The idea that I can lend something to you and I know that you will bring it back, and it creates a sharing relationship. The idea that we all together own something in common is actually a very beautiful concept, and it starts to collectivize both the idea of having knowledge getting knowledge and sharing knowledge. So it goes back to that social life that books acquire between people, even if we never talk. Libraries are a place of some of the ultimate resource sharing. I love the downtown Seattle Library here in the Duwamish territories because it has so many different layers to it. I can walk through the various floors and find things from like how to use a certain type of tool at my home down to different like very intricate scientific things to comic books or other stories that I might want to engage. And a library provides an array of knowledge for people to interact with. It also becomes a place where we can share the knowledge that we have. So one of the dynamic things I love about what the library system is doing here is creating opportunities for community members to give talks, or the downtown Seattle Library has started to have themes. A few years ago, one of the themes was about the idea that we'll all be free one day, and creating a space for community members to talk about experiences within the carceral system, impacts the carceral system has upon community, but then to also imagine what is an abolitionist vision, and can within the library space we have a conversation about a world beyond prisons, a world beyond a punitive jail system or a punitive criminal legal system? Can we imagine a world where things are restorative? And the library is such a perfect place to have those conversations, to share and deepen our analysis about what it means to live in the world that we live in. Which brings me to thinking about libraries as the people's university. Open, free public libraries not only just provides books, but it also provides technology access. It provides access to great writers. It is an obvious place for when writers come into town for them to present conversations, for them to be in conversation with the audience, the readers that are engaging their material. And they present a broad array of information and access to various perspectives. And I think of libraries as an open forum. Now, this has started to come up as a struggle, is like, where do First Amendment issues in libraries connect? What is the difference between free speech and hate speech? And what I think is beautiful about the conversation we are currently having through the public library system is there a line between having those free, open conversations, people having their opinions, and speech in those spaces that actually does harm? And we're seeing libraries across Turtle Island having to grapple with this when they have certain types of speakers use the space. Is what's happening here really an act of free speech? Is this person really, or this group, just sharing their opinion, or are they doing harm to other people in this space? And as much as that is a legal question, it is also an ethics question and a moral question. And I think it's a question we'll continue to grapple with in our public libraries, because they have historically and presently remained a place of social conversation and also sometimes discord. Libraries are also a space where we can build diverse community. I think about the various income levels that access a library, especially in the downtown Seattle library, knowing that you have folks from some of the highest socioeconomic levels in our region in the same space as folks in our region who don't have homes. And what does that opportunity to cross each other's paths do? Now, my hope is that it humanizes people, that we see people's humanity, we understand the importance of needs and resources and having safe spaces to be. But I also know that libraries can also segregate communities. When I look across Seattle King County, where I live, all libraries are not created equal. They don't all have the same types of information. They don't all have access to the same types of books in them. And they don't all have the same quality of structure or space for people to be in. And so also just thinking about the physical space of a library, how it is built, who it is made for, can also direct us to think about, is this space actually equitable? Is this space actually usable? And are we creating it for everyone to be in, for this to continue to be a place where people from different perspectives and backgrounds can converge? So I want to give a few minutes. I'm going to give 3 minutes. If you all in the chat would write a few things about what you think about a library as a place or concept. What comes to mind for you before I dig into some of the things that I think libraries do? For you, what is library as a space or a concept? And you can do that in the chat. I'm going to give about 3 minutes to do that. So I'm going to turn off my video so you're not looking at my face. But just type in some ideas into the chat box. Commit to an idea. One of the things I know as an educator is when you commit to an idea, you're more likely to remember the rest of the ideas that come. All right. Thank you so much for engaging in that. There are some really great thoughts in here. I'm going to highlight a few. Placemaking defines the feel of a community. I also see someone wrote exclusion comes to mind first. And I saw someone else talk about all libraries are not created equal, but also a lot of conversation about community, a space without the obligation to buy things. There was a story in the chat about a professor who would take their children to the library as a place to have an adventure, and how the library as a place to have an adventure actually permeated the work of this professor in thinking about poverty. Uh, Libraries as a community gathering space or place to discover new opportunities for sharing knowledge. Uh, Also as a shelter, thinking about libraries as not just a shelter for knowledge or information, but also libraries as a shelter for people. So we all have a lot of different ideas about what a library is. And I want to think about it not just as a place, but also as a concept, and in particular, a concept for revolutionizing and evolving our understanding of community. Someone said in the chat, libraries should meet community need. And I think as one of the few spaces in our cities where there are free resources, free books, and public dollars that sustain the model of a library, it should certainly be a place that is responsive to community needs. And also just remembering we can have the perfect library as a space, but a library is nothing if it doesn't have people accessing it and using it. So just as important as the library is as a space or a place with books and resources, it has to be a place that people want to access and use. And libraries are nothing if they're not for how people relate to each other and the information that they provide. So The first thing is I want to think about libraries as a place to belong. And I'm going to play a video for you, and we will see how this goes on the Zoom share. So this video is about a story from a librarian. And I love librarians. I think librarians have so much to teach us. And I'll tell you a story later about how a librarian transformed my experience with books, and not just with books, but also with education. But this particular story for me highlights the importance of what libraries mean when it comes to belonging.
When you work in a public library, you never know who's going to come through that door. You never know what questions they're going to ask. One day, a young boy who was 8 or 9 years old asked an unusual question. He had been hanging out in the library all summer, and he said, "I have an idea. I'd like to check out a room today. I'd like to check out a room for the week, as a matter of fact. I've been scoping the space out, and you have a story hour room you're not using, and a puppet stage that doesn't seem to be used, and I'd like to put together a puppet program for the kids and their families on Friday afternoon. What do you think?" It's an unusual question, and I clicked through my mind as to, well, what could possibly go wrong? Seemed like an innocent enough question, and I thought, okay, let's go for it. So I said yes, with 2 caveats. One, you just need to check in and out with the staff so that they know where you are, and you need to pick up after yourself. He did exactly that. He came in every afternoon, he set up the stage, he worked on his project, he worked with the puppets. On Friday afternoon, there were signs, handmade, all over the library. Puppet show, 2 o'clock. He gathered about 30 people in the story hour room, kids and their moms and their dads. He did a lovely puppet show. The kids clapped. He was happy. I thought he was a star. Good idea. He left, and we didn't see him for a couple of weeks. Later that fall, he came in on a Saturday. He came up to the desk, and he brought his dad with him. He said, "Today's my birthday, and of all the places in the world, the place I wanted to come to the most was the library. I want to introduce you to my dad." And then he said, "But I have some news. We're going to be moving away. My dad got a job. We're moving out of the homeless shelter. We have an apartment. And we're not going to be able to come back to the library anymore. But I wanted to say goodbye and thank you." So as that boy and his dad left, I had this big lump in my throat. Little did I know that when he asked that question, how important it was for him to have that space to create, to think, to fulfill some dreams. He needed someone to have the instinct to say yes, and I'm so grateful that I did. He needed somebody to be on his side. Isn't that what we all need? Some people question the relevance.
So what I think is dynamic about that story is there's a few pieces there when I think about the importance of what it means to belong and to have a space to belong. The first is having someone who just says yes. I mean, just the concept of a young person coming up and saying, "Can I check out a space?" That's not the question you necessarily usually hear at a library. You might hear, "Can I check out a book? Can I use a computer?" But this young person wanted to use a space. And libraries creating a usable space for people is so important, especially in a city like the one I live in, where there are communities that don't have access to usable spaces. They don't have access to free spaces. Space is such a valuable commodity in the city of Seattle. And there are a lot of communities, especially communities that are being displaced or gentrified, where the library starts to become the only space where they can access a place that they can actually use for the purpose of doing something they care about. What else I think is unique about that story is it created an opportunity for creativity. The program that I work for, Creative Justice, is an arts-based alternative to incarceration in a healing engaged space. We do that through giving young folks the tools to create the world or the things they want to see, to both explore the world they live in now, but to also explore the world that they want to live in. It is important to have a space and a container, an opportunity for creativity. And I think libraries have the ability to create that. And to have space to think, to fulfill a dream is huge. I don't know about y'all, but being in my house 24/7 right now, trying to do the work that I do is actually starting to feel even more challenging doing it in my home container, because different containers provide different opportunities for different types of thinking. What kind of container is the library offering people for creative, dream fulfilling thinking, like what this young person experienced? Libraries as a place to belong can adapt to communities' needs when they are open to hearing the types of access needs that community members want to have. And I think it's very important that libraries and also educational institutions learn to be responsive to communities, especially marginalized communities or disenfranchised communities that, for a myriad of reasons around equity, but also disenfranchisement in our society, lack access to the types of spaces, actual places that can allow them to dream, create, and fulfill dreams in that space. I think also about the value of this librarian in that space. She became an early responder for this young person. Who knows what would have happened had she said, no, you cannot check out a space, you're too young. And this is something I think about daily in the work that I do with young folks in our city, is that by providing a studio space full of art supplies, full of music equipment, full of teaching artists who engage young people around learning skills, we become early responders for needs, but also we become interveners. And we don't know what kind of intervener this librarian was, but it's clear that she was an early responder in a situation with this young person who needed a space to be, but also needed a space to dream. And libraries can become a place of creation and collaboration. Doing a story time through a puppet story time is not something that is separate from the audience that participates in it. It is actually a collaboration. I can tell you firsthand right now, doing a keynote on Zoom is very different than doing a keynote in front of folks, where I experience your facial expressions, where I can hear your laughs. I mean, it's very hard to tell a joke on Zoom. So there is something about the space that was created in that story that was not only creative, but it was also creating a collaborative opportunity for this young person and the community that they are in. And it becomes a place to share stories and a place to share passion, which we don't know what happened to that young person next, but what we do know is that young person may have discovered a passion, but also found the library to be enough of a space of belonging that they didn't just want to leave. They actually needed to go back and tell the librarian, I won't be coming back. And I always think that when someone comes back to you to tell you they're making their exit, and they do it in a way that shows you the value of that space, that is very significant. The next concept, in addition to thinking about libraries as a place for belonging, and also thank you, Madeline, for letting me know you definitely just laughed. Libraries are a place for social struggle and equity. Thinking about taking us back to the concept of a library in a prison. Now, I'm an abolitionist, so from my perspective, I think that prisons are inherently traumatizing. Our current criminal legal system is inherently punitive. And so the way that I see it, prisons as they exist now cannot continue to exist if communities are going to be healthy, if all of our communities are going to be healthy. But what I will say is important in our current way of being is libraries and prisons and access to books for incarcerated peoples, is understanding, just going back to that idea of knowledge is power. having access to ideas, even when your body is restrained, does something for the mental fortitude and spiritual resilience of a human being. It is also incredibly empowering. I know numerous jailhouse attorneys who are much better attorneys than I am. You know, even though I went to law school at the University of Washington, even though I've passed the bar, and I know how to study the law, there's something very dynamic about the knowing that this knowledge in front of you is the only access to the outside world you have, and have experienced the power of what happens when incarcerated people have access to books. I've also seen the devastation of what happens when incarcerated people don't have access to books. So it's not even just the library that is a space of access for social struggle or even creating equity. It's also just the sheer knowledge that is contained in those libraries. So we're going to watch one more video. We're going to watch it all the way through for about 5 minutes. And then I'm going to break down 2 more concepts. And I want you to be thinking about, from your perspective, what is the next evolution of libraries? How do libraries go even more public? How do libraries take the concepts that we're experiencing through the internet and also have them play out in the library space? Because what is significant about the library, and somebody mentioned this in the chat, is the internet doesn't necessarily have a way of helping you sort knowledge. What libraries do have, and I'll go back to that librarian, is an access point of someone who also helps you navigate the world of knowledge. So where do libraries, internet, and also even technological gaps come together to evolve for a way in which communities, especially marginalized or disenfranchised communities, can continue to have access to knowledge as power?
Boxed notes, limitations of gender, class, ethnicity, and race,
Sorry, I'm gonna start that over
equality,
a little bit.
and But the history of the library isn't only a celebratory one, since, as Boxed notes, limitations of gender, class, ethnicity, and race belied the rhetoric of Republican equality, and social libraries helped to institutionalize a more democratic print culture that valued books not as a form of elite property, but rather a medium of mass circulation. Instead of enforcing status and educational and social hierarchies dominated by the learned ministry and gentlemen, books acquired social life through exchange and use. In her article on the Carnegie-funded library in DC, NPR's Susan Stamberg noted that in the early 20th century, Black people remembered that it was the only building downtown where they were allowed to use the bathroom. But libraries often fell short of their promise to distribute their wares to the masses without bias. That's why in the first half of the 20th century, throughout the struggles of segregation, Jim Crow, and the Civil Rights Movement, Black communities and Black librarians have fought tirelessly to ensure the actual democratic dissemination of knowledge. Like William Carl Bolivar, a Black Philadelphian, bibliophile, and journalist who published a column in the Philadelphia Tribune and served as an organizer of and contributor to the American Negro Historical Society because he wanted to change the way Black history was being preserved and spread. Or Regina Anderson Andrews, who became the first African American supervising librarian in the history of the New York Public Library, working there from 1923 to 1967. Or Eliza Atkins Gleason, who became the first African American to earn a PhD in library science in 1940. And Professor Michael Foltz traces the history of Black libraries in the South during the first half of the 20th century in his article. Foltz notes that after the Civil War, Black communities prioritized the building of public schools before the building of libraries. But by the early 20th century, Black-run libraries began to spread nationwide and continued to develop alongside the fight for desegregation. And now that you know, you can wrap things up.
Thanks, Evelyn. So I've traced the history of libraries, but that leaves us with our final burning question. Do we still need them in the internet age? Well, in the 20th century and into the dawn of the 21st, the relationship between violent conflict and libraries was sadly reinvigorated. And in places where battles raged and human life was lost, the destruction of the library often got folded into the fallout. Take, for example, the library destroyed during the siege of Sarajevo in 1992, the destruction of libraries in Baghdad in 2003, and the obliteration of Chinese libraries by Japanese forces during World War II. But despite the arresting symbol of cultural loss that burning a library represents, some brick and mortar buildings are suffering a decline in budgets or usage in the wake of easy access to online alternatives. But the numbers can often feel contradictory. One 2015 editorial review from the New York Times asserted that 37 million people a year visit New York's libraries, a number that is greater than the total number of visitors at the city's baseball stadiums, its basketball and hockey arenas, all its performing arts spaces, city-owned museums, gardens, and zoos. But a 2016 Pew report also found that in 2015, only 44% of Americans visited a public library in the past year, a number that was down from 53% in 2012. But even though the debates over numbers can leave us more confused than ever before, here's one final number on the pile. The same Pew survey found that 76% of Americans surveyed felt like libraries serve their community's educational needs well or pretty well. Those in favor of libraries note that they can be one of the few places within a community that offer all of their services largely free of charge. Just like the library funded by Carnegie in DC would let everyone use the restroom, some library visitors today are from vulnerable populations that need clean, safe, and accessible spaces. Like kids who use libraries to gain access to the internet to complete their homework or take advantage of library programs to fill the gap between the end of the school day and when their parents come home from work. Or senior citizens who use libraries as social hubs for various activities. Or out-of-work adults who use the library for continuing education and for seeking new employment opportunities. Librarians often fill the gap left by other social services for children and adults alike by helping folks to navigate the resources in their communities, scheduling ongoing programming, and helping us all to be lifelong learners. I've even seen millennials and Gen Z folks online arguing that libraries should stay open late, like coffee shops and bars, because they would offer a social alternative to spending money and drinking if you wanted to hang out with your friends, which I'm not against, and if anyone out there wants to organize a late night library social where we all read in solidarity, then hit me up. So while the debate over the cost of their edifices rages on, libraries continue to occupy a very fraught liminal space between relic and living archive. They house all of our social, cultural, and political history, ideas, and contentions in one place. So even though our eyes and search engines may make it seem like everything else has shifted online, our bodies are still out here knocking around in real time, craving social interaction and community. And if most of us love them when they're around and mourn them deeply when they're lost, it seems like, at least for now, the library as an IRL institution is here to stay, even when budgets get pinched and squeezed.
So before we do some question and answer, I really want to drive us to think about the importance, especially now, as many of us find ourselves very isolated, very separated from each other, is libraries as an in real life institution, as a free space to be, especially as we probably enter into an economic recession, probably have never been more important, at least in my short 35 years of life, than they have before. And I want to tell you a story about the way in which a library transformed my life and why I think libraries need to continue to be a space that we evolve and advance. So when I was a first grader, going way back into time, my first grade teacher had told my mom she did not think I was going to be a very good reader. And it kind of automatically turned me off to books. And thank the universe for the librarian I encountered in my elementary school library. I had gone into the library after this parent-teacher conference where I had overheard my teacher tell my mom she didn't think I was going to be a very strong reader. I had to get some sort of book to read for class because it was an assignment to read 30 minutes every day. And she asked me why I wasn't actively looking for a book like the other students. And I had expressed to her, I just don't think I'm a very good reader. And she asked me some questions. She dug into the context of where that feeling came from. And she brought to me Shel Silverstein's Where the Sidewalk Ends. And the beauty of that book was for someone as a child in the situation I was in, experiencing feeling like I was never going to read very well, and also not having yet been figured out that I'm dyslexic, and I just needed some different tools for reading. Poetry, especially short poems that served a purpose, that had a moral, it wasn't just reading to read, became something I could engage. And so I read that book over and over, and it became a book that I learned to read with. But even more, it laid the groundwork for a passion I may not have discovered, but for being in that space, interacting with that librarian, discovering a type of knowledge that I enjoyed. I got into poetry. I started writing. The things that I wrote started having rhythm and rhyme. And as I got older, I got into the open mic scene, and the open mic scene led to the slam scene, and the slam scene led to becoming a storyteller, and becoming a storyteller became getting in front of audiences and sharing my ideas, growing those ideas in the conversation you have with an audience also became the foundation for the work that I do politically in community. It also set the tone for my belief that creativity and art, and having access to art's knowledge, is both healing and liberating. And so set the stage for the work that I do now with creative justice, and using arts as a platform for young people to tell their stories to transform the criminal legal system. I'm sure that Librarian has absolutely no idea that as a first grader, she transformed the trajectory of the work that I do. But her asking me what I needed, her asking me what I was interested in, and helping provide something for me really had a dynamic impact on the trajectory of my life. And so this is why I think libraries and librarians are essential for the work that needs to happen in the world, even with the internet. You can Google whatever you want to on the internet, but Google is never going to have a conversation with you to find out what you are needing or what you want to know about in the same way that someone within the library context may do that. And there are so many other types of resources in libraries, including things like tax support or knowledge sharing opportunities, storytelling opportunities, like the young person we heard about in the first story. And so these things are so important. So as we engage this kind of next interactive part of the conversation, I want you to think about libraries in two ways. The first is libraries as a space for liberation. I learned in that moment that libraries could become a place where I could find information I was interested in, information that could change my life, information that was accessible. And for that reason, when I was in law school, I went to New York City for the first time to live. The first place that I went was the New York City Public Library. So not only did the librarian help the trajectory of my life, she also cemented for me that places with books, places with resources are actually a place that you can go, even in a new place when you don't know where to go. The second part is thinking about libraries as a space for mutual aid. In the time that we are living in right now, we have not more than ever in the last, again, my short 35 years, needed to have a place where community members can share mutual aid with each other, whether that's information about how to grow a garden, or how to fix something at your house, or how to deal with a financial or utility issue, or how to do your taxes. We need libraries to be a space of mutual aid, where people can come together and share resources and share knowledge and be able to build each other up. The thing that I think is most dynamic about the library system that is around me now is there is some sort of building that is considered a library, at least in the area that I live, in almost every neighborhood that I partner with young people in to do work. And so how do we use these free funded spaces as a way for people in the midst of this crisis and post this crisis, once we are allowed to have gathering spaces again, how does this become a free gathering space for people to share knowledge and mutual aid with each other? So in the chat for like the next 3 minutes, I would like for you to say, what is the next evolution for libraries? I want you to dream big, and I want you to dream about the evolution of the services. And I want you to think about, how do we go even further public? I think considering the ways in which research libraries work or university libraries work, because I do see some conversation about how databases and the information in those databases is locked away. I think about, in law school, I had access to what is called Westlaw, and I had access to law librarians. But now that I'm supposed to be a real lawyer in the real world, I have to pay thousands of dollars to access Westlaw. I have to pay thousands of dollars to access knowledge from our courts that is essential to my ability to not only do my work, but essential for the people that I partner with to navigate the legal system. How do we go public with this information in a capitalist society where the goal is to commodify information? And what responsibilities do libraries and universities have in evolving our understanding of knowledge as power, not just power for the few who can afford to access it, but especially power for marginalized and disenfranchised communities? So I'm going to give you 3 minutes. Please send some things into the chat. And also, if you have questions, be thinking of those, and you can send them to the Q&A box. So I want y'all to continue sharing ideas. There's a few here that I really would love to engage. As someone who has had the chance to pursue a university education, I definitely consider myself to be privileged. But as an independent researcher, I have had so many struggles with access to research and scholarship. There are books that I know are in my city, and I can see them on databases, but they are locked behind university library systems. This is a struggle I absolutely understand and engage with on a regular basis as I try to access legal scholarship or ideas that will help me create better cases for my clients. And the reality is that as an attorney, there's the idea that attorneys are all making money, that attorneys are all wealthy, that attorneys can afford to pay the fee to access this information, which really, for an attorney in my position who does pro bono work, it puts a huge burden on me that if I cannot afford to make up the cost to pay for the systems to access this information, I really cannot give my clients the best service that they deserve. And really, the only way to make the money to have access to those is often to put the cost or the burden upon my clients, which would then make doing pro bono work a challenge. And so I think it is actually essential that we figure out how to open these databases up. How do we get books, especially when we're thinking about our public universities that tax dollars are going towards? How does that information, how is it accessible to the public? How does it make serving all communities easier? And I saw someone talk about knowledge as a public good. This is the same way I feel about something like municipal broadband. Municipal broadband should be a public utility. Knowledge should be a public good, because the more people know the truth, the stories of other people, the more we exchange knowledge and build a relationship with each other through our stories, through the places that we come from, the better we can understand the places we are trying to go as a community. And so absolutely, knowledge has to be a public good. Also, this comment here, something that comes to mind for me is that libraries as a container of and access point to knowledge inherently give expression to the processes of knowledge production, which have been and continue to be highly exclusive and limiting. In reference to your question about how libraries go more public and what is next for libraries, I feel that libraries as an institution are uniquely positioned to help advocate for changing the ways we conceptualize and engage in knowledge production processes, including challenging the limited ways that we define what knowledge is and can be, as well as who can be included in its production. And libraries are limiting. They're often white, Eurocentric, they're androcentric, they're positivistic. I've never used that word. Thank you, Megan. I think we have to figure out how we expand the idea of what we think knowledge is, of how we value knowledge. It is a privilege to have your knowledge, your cultural perspective, your language included in a public library. How do libraries continue to expand the sorts of stories made available? How do we decenter Eurocentric ideas of storytelling and find ways to be intersectional as a library? What are the responsibilities to libraries universities have when it comes to knowledge as power? Libraries should be available to be a place of residence for homeless people. This is a conversation in many cities like Seattle that we're routinely engaging. You heard that Carnegie was a place, those libraries were a place where anyone could just use the restroom. It was viewed as a public space. And I cannot tell you the number of cases I've actually engaged or complaints I've helped file for people just based on the fact that I'm an unhoused person and I was denied access or denied space in this library. And how do libraries become a place where communities can humanize folks, but also feel a responsibility, especially in a city like Seattle, to be engaging the powers that be, the bureaucratic structures around something like housing affordability? How do we see a library as a place of inspiration, as politicizing people, and for democratization? How does that continue? University libraries being the leader who imagines and creates spaces for poverty class students, to be the places and spaces not only of belonging, but to learn the different forms of knowledge that exist. I didn't know about non-colonial stories as of understanding structural inequality and inequity until a professor shared some of these stories. In these imagined spaces, lives that are shaped by generational poverty can flourish and become the people to create the change that is so desperately needed. I can say firsthand, as a young person who routinely used the public library as a child, if there had not been a library accessible to my family, there is so much information I would have never learned and so much inspiration I would not have gained. So even in lieu of not having access to some of the things that my wealthier peers had access to, the library did provide me with access to information. What I will also say is there is a sort of resiliency I learned. I am very much a self-teacher. There are lots of things that I have learned to just go get a book and teach myself that many of my peers who did not have to access knowledge in the same way that I did, they don't necessarily have that same skill of being able to crack open a book and teach yourself something. So there is something to having access to a library and having it be a space of the people's university that also can be very empowering for communities. My hope is, though, also that we don't just see library as the free university for economically disenfranchised folks, but that we see it as a place, as a change agent. We cannot leave our society to be as inequitable economically as it is. We cannot allow capitalism to continue to exploit and commodify people and knowledge and access to those things. We need libraries to also be a place that inspires people to be a part of making change, and not just the Band-Aid for lack of access to things like universities or income or thriving opportunities for families, for breaking those chains of generational poverty. So there are so many other incredible comments in here, y'all. I'm very excited about the thoughts that you have put in here. I hope that you'll go through and you'll read them. My goal today was not necessarily to give answers. It was to illuminate some of the values I see of libraries, but also universities and institutions that do house knowledge. What does it mean to be a gatekeeper? What does it mean to open the gates? What does it mean to get to define what knowledge is or how knowledge works? How do we begin to use the internet? which is essentially a free platform still. I mean, there are some gates now to accessing certain information because of the way capitalism works. But how do we use these platforms to go even more public, but also how do we preserve the relationship building opportunity, the community building opportunity? And for me, the opportunity to engage with someone like a librarian or another resource person within those buildings that does what Google cannot do, can actually hear you and be a part of you discovering a passion or knowledge that you're interested in. So I know we have a few minutes for questions, and Elliot was helping to monitor the Q&A.
Yep. Hello, everybody. My name is Elliot Stevens. I'm a librarian at the University of Washington. I use he, him pronouns. And I just really want to thank Nikkita for an incredible, thoughtful keynote speech. I feel like this is such a great way to get us started today and going public, and just the opinions that you have and the questions that you've raised and seeing the way that you're thinking and how open you are as a person, Nikkita, has just been really enlightening for me today. And I don't know if we all just want to really quickly, like either in our rooms, in our containers, or just here in the chat pod, like let's give Nikkita a round of applause somehow. Like I saw someone found a clapping hands emoji, so I'm just going to write clapping in the chat pod. But I thought it was just an amazing, amazing presentation. So we have some very good questions. And so the first question that I would like to ask, and this is coming from an anonymous attendee: how can we create equity in access to brick and mortar libraries and to the internet? Not everyone can physically get to a library, and not everyone has internet access. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap between those groups. So I think this is a question relating to accessibility, but also to digital inequity.
Yeah, you know, there's the space accessibility or the place accessibility, and I don't want to pretend that I have all of the ideas, because I don't. And I really think we have to better engage this concept of universal design, and we have to be actively engaging the truth about the society we live in. It is one that is grossly inequitable. So I think, you know, part of the idea is just like the space or the place. And as a society, if I think about the place that I live right now, those who probably would most use the library in terms of like just needing a space are the ones being pushed the farthest outside of the city. If cities in many ways are built around libraries, which we learned that libraries do become a focal point for how a cityscape is built, we have to also be thinking about having equitable transportation. How do we have a transportation system that moves in lockstep with development, but also how do we have a transportation system that makes it so people can get to a public good like a library? I'm also thinking about the internet as a platform, and you know, it has never been more evident to me than it is right now, as we're dealing with COVID-19, as some of us are in shelter in place, or dealing with shelter in place orders or stay home, stay healthy orders, how important municipal broadband is. To live in one of the ultimate tech cities and know that there are young people experiencing the technology gap, we have to be actively advocating for our municipalities to be investing in the infrastructure to ensure that we treat things like access to the internet as a public utility, as a public good. This is something everyone should have access to, as opposed to something that has been commodified. And then at that point, I think libraries have to figure out, how do libraries evolve to get as much information accessible digitally as possible, but also how do you grow the librarian relationship into the digital context? Does that mean we have digital librarians? Does that mean we have librarians that engage through Zoom? How do we get information to communities to even know how to use these new digital ways of doing things? And so I really think it's a multifaceted idea about how we design our cities, how we design transportation. Where do we put libraries? As people are pushed out, we need to expand where libraries are. I also think we have to be actively advocating for municipal broadband. And then maybe the future librarians are also tech gurus. I don't know. There's a lot of opportunity, and that becomes a part of also our educational system. How are we thinking about what it means to be in the tech industry? Do librarians have a place in the tech industry? I think so, but now we have to figure out how we evolve the educational opportunity to grow that kind of new form of public service.
Thank you, Nikkita. Here's another really important question. This is from Constance McBaron. How can libraries serve as inflection points for supporting the creation and amplification of non-cis, non-white, non-male stories?
Yeah, something I wish I had researched prior to this conversation was what what is the makeup of most librarians, and what is the curriculum that librarians go through when they study library sciences. And in terms of the curriculum piece, I can probably answer that question because it happens in the same white male dominated institutions that I went through for law school. It's the same institutions I went through for university. And so I can only imagine the sort of information that is there. So I think one key place is to start changing the kinds of things that we teach folks as they get into the library sciences. In the educational setting, as much as we talk about equity, as much as we talk about diversifying, quote unquote, the curriculum, College of Ed schools still very much use the same antiquated ways of teaching and the same baseline curriculum, and have not grown the sorts of knowledge we engage to learn how to be strong educators. I can imagine the library sciences, it's similar. I also think that we need to be responsive to community need. Look at who's in your library. If I look at the library here in the Rainier Beach neighborhood where I'm at, it is mostly Black and brown youth. There is no reason why there shouldn't be Black and brown non-cis information available. But then we also have to engage publishing companies. As a writer, as an author, I know that it has been very hard for publishers to take the work that I do seriously because they don't necessarily even believe that there is a market for the work that I do, or the work that I bring to the lit world. So there's also just the issue of publishing still being very cis white male dominated, or at least that idea of what should be there. And that is a whole nother area that we have to engage and figure out how to transform. I mean, at the root of this, it is the idea of what does decolonial thought look like? What does intersectional thought look like? And the hope that I have is the young folks that I partner with in the work that I do, they are leaps and bounds ahead of where I was at their age. And so as they start to take over things, I know that they will be disruptive. So for those of us who are yelders, young elders, and those of us who are elders, how do we partner with young people as they are becoming the change agents, as they are the change agents and disrupting this, whether that's the curriculum in their schools or what's available in their libraries? Are we being responsive to the critique and ideas that they're bringing to us?
Thank you. And here's one that gets at free speech and hate speech. This is from Caitlin. Nikkita, I love what you said about libraries recognizing the line between First Amendment, free speech, and hate speech. Do you have any advice specifically about pushing back against hate speech in libraries under the justification of free speech? As a future librarian, I am concerned about how to approach certain situations with quote unquote neutrality when it feels impossible to do so.
Yeah, this is such a complicated challenge, and it's actually something that, both as an activist and organizer and as an attorney, I've been actively engaging. And I think the challenge here is asking ourselves whether or not neutrality is the place to fall. If we choose to be neutral and allow ideas that are that do have elements of hate in them or hate rhetoric in them to be present in the library, have we in some way become complicit? I think there's a couple of ways to approach this. I think one of them is balance. How are we ensuring that when there are ideas that may be dehumanizing to folks or do harm, also bringing in an overwhelming amount of ideas that speak to the other points of view? Are we actually, quote unquote, being neutral if we're not ensuring that the other experiences also exist in the space? That's one way to deal with it. I think another way to engage it, and I'm sure there are plenty of ways to engage it, is to decide to say that neutrality at this moment in time is not the best direction for us to go. And obviously in the US on Turtle Island, that probably will amount to some lawsuits. And to be frank, most municipalities do not want to engage in those kinds of lawsuits because they are a financial liability. However, I think there is the reality of, especially as we approach this next election, are we making distinctions between creating a space for all ideas to exist versus creating a space where ideas that may actually perpetuate harm to exist? And I really think that is the line we have to be deeply assessing. When I was in law school, or right after law school, during the first election of 45, there was a speaker allowed to speak at the University of Washington where there was a mass protest. That same week, we were also supposed to have a number of Black History Month events, and they allowed that speaker to speak, but they canceled all the Black History Month events for fear that Black students would be harmed. And that to me felt like falling in the wrong direction, that if anything, there should have been more effort given to ensuring that these events speaking to Black history and Black culture had been protected and safeguarded and uplifted and amplified. And if any event had not existed, it should have been the one from someone who not only did people believe was going to bring hate speech to the campus, but actually already had a track record of hate speech. So that's the third thing, I think has to be brought into account is, does who you're allowing to speak in a space have a track record of hate speech? If they do, that's very different than just saying their idea is hate-based, right? You know that they've gone into spaces, they've gone into public spaces and actively brought hate to the forefront, is a very different thing than just the assumption that it might exist. And I do think that that requires some sort of action, or at least a response to say, we're not going to condone this kind of behavior. If we see it happening during an event or in a space, we will definitely shut it down. And again, that comes with complexities. Municipalities don't want to engage in lawsuits. And from a legal perspective, I understand avoiding that liability. I'm not sure it is the best way for us as a nation to actually make strides towards equity and equality.
Thank you, Nikkita. And we have, there's one more question here. Let me see. There's one that I had queued up, but now I'm having a... This is a great one too. Besides voting on levies and bonds to fund libraries, what can citizens do to make libraries open, welcome spaces that nurture our whole community?
I think the first thing I would say is be in your public library. Don't view the library as just a space for some people, but a space for all people. I think a space becomes more viable for continued investment and expansion when it is a space that is used by lots of groups of people. I think about our downtown Seattle library and who accesses that library, but also who experiences some marginalization in that space. How are you an advocate within that space or partnering with that space to see it be a place where people are humanized? I think libraries should be a place for open programming. And if you're seeing something, do something about it. How can you be a part of engaging the conversations that are created in that library? I have to shout out Davita Ingram, who works at the Downtown Seattle Public Library here. And she does a lot of work around equity and access, and has actually made it a place where a lot of people in our communities, from organizers and activists to storytellers and scholars and intellectuals, also people who maybe don't even view themselves as folks who should be programming in the library. She has created a space for those folks to provide programming, and also made use of the funding that she has allocated in her role to also ensure people receive compensation for that funding. for that work. I do want to touch a little bit, in that idea of compensation, about this idea of research databases and what happens to independent researchers when places like libraries start to offer that research for free. Is compensation is very important, and I think we have to stop acting like these universities are broke. I paid a lot of money to the University of Washington, and it makes me wonder, where is the money going, and how are universities, how are cities and states that are benefiting from the knowledge that independent researchers bring to the table, how are they actually using their allocated funding in a way that supports people? We spend a lot of money on things that has nothing to do with supporting people. And if our institutions value independent research, they'll figure out a way to both make databases accessible at much lower cost rates, while simultaneously, how do we reallocate our funding in a way that supports people more than it does other things like profit or property?
Well, thank you so much, Nikkita Oliver, for this really great keynote, and we have it recorded, and we're looking forward to making it available for people who have attended, who will want to listen to it again. I will definitely listen to this one again, and also make it available for people who couldn't attend today. Thank you so much for your generosity, for your care, and for your action.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope you'll have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. And let's give Nikkita Oliver one more round of virtual applause here in our chat pod. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right. At this time, we're going to stop recording and we're going to take a few minutes to stretch and reset for our next presenters, Chris Coward and Jason Young.